Thanks everyone for joining us. This is the April Backup and Recovery Office Hours, and today I'm going to talk about autonomous recovery service versus object storage. We're going to talk about it, the advantages and cost comparisons with long-term retention. My name is Kelly Smith. I'm on the product management team for backup and recovery technologies at Oracle. So let's just get started. I appreciate everybody joining us today. So the first is, why are we doing this comparison between recovery service and object storage? And the reason is because those are your two choices for configuring automatic backups in OCI, in uh, Azure, and AWS, and Google for the um, managed database services that Oracle provides. So you can see right there, you've got the two options. Autonomous recovery services are recommended solution, and I think everybody will understand why as we go through this presentation. Just from a strict service comparison perspective, um, object storage is designed for all different types of data. It's a great solution for all the different types of data that could exist in your environment. Autonomous recovery service, on the other hand, is specifically for the Oracle database. So we're doing a lot of work in the recovery service itself to do specific things with the Oracle database to make backup and recovery operations much more efficient um, and much more integrated. And as I mentioned before, the recovery service covers databases that are running on OCI, the Oracle database at Azure, the Oracle database at AWS, and the Oracle database at Google Cloud. Um, all have the option to protect to the autonomous recovery service. The first thing I want to do here to kind of level set, because we're going to be talking about two different types of backups today. We're going to be talking about operational backups and long-term retention backups. So I want to talk a little bit about the difference between the two so that everybody has a good understanding. Um, Operational backups are your frequently scheduled backups. They're your daily, hourly, minute scheduled backups that happen on a regular frequency. The long-term retention backups are the ones that you need like once a month, maybe once a week, once a quarter, once a year. Just these, broad strokes for a less frequent schedule to create those backups. And operational backups target incremental changes to the database. So because you're doing them so frequently, you're trying to capture all the changes that have occurred in the database, where long-term retention backups are full self-contained because you want to have this representation of the database at the end of the week, end of the month, end of the quarter, and it has to be all encapsulated. The operational backups allow for recovery to any point in time within the recovery window. So if you're running, backups that are for 30 days, that means any point in time between December 15th and January 15th, if that was your 30-day window, you would be able to recover to any point in time in there. Long-term retention backups are first a specific point in time. Like I mentioned, like last day of the month at 11 p.m. We want to be able to capture the database and save it. Operational backups, obviously, fast recovery is essential because those are your most recent backups. You want to make sure that they're, available and you can recover up to that point in time incredibly fast. Where long-term retention backups are for compliance. You've got that last day of the month, and usually you only have to recall that if there's a compliance need that comes along, and you need to recover that database. So very different SLAs with that database backup. Operational backups are, retained for days because we're talking about every single change in the database. Those backups can get very large very quick, especially, if you're talking about 30 days of every single change that occurred in the database versus long-term retention backups are retained for years because it's just a single point in time. It's my, last day of the month. I'm going to retain it for 5 years and I'm going to keep it around. So it's just a single point in time. If you tried to retain all the data that occurred in the database for 5 years, it would grow enormously large. It would be unmanageable and incredibly costly. So an example of an operational backup is a daily database backup, archive redo logs every 30 minutes, and we're going to retain that for 30 days. Versus a long-term retention backup, it's a monthly database backup, and we're going to retain that for 5 years. Again, that single point in time versus every single change that occurred. Okay, so now let's talk specifically about operational backups and the differences between recovery service and object storage. So from a pure backup operation, object storage does weekly fulls, daily incrementals, and this periodic log backup. The recovery service has an incremental forever paradigm. And when that incremental runs, it produces a virtual full behind the scenes. So that's available for recovery. And then we have this optional concept of real-time protection of the database, which is doing real-time log protection. Um, and the big problem here for databases as they get larger is object storage is doing a weekly full. That means that you're having to move every byte of the database every week, whether it's changed or not. The recovery service, on the other hand, is only moving the changes. So your backup size shrinks considerably, and the time it takes to produce the backup shrinks considerably. Takes a lot of load off the production database with the recovery service versus object storage that's trying to move a lot of data every week. From a validation perspective, if you're going to be doing backups, please do validations. Validations is that process lets you know that the backups are good and that they're complete. And object storage relies on database resources to do that validation. So if you have a weekly full backup that takes 10 hours to complete, your validation process is also going to take 10 hours to complete. So it's a lot of time on resources on the database. With the recovery service, we use the incremental forever process to pull the blocks from the database. And then the validation is fully offloaded onto the recovery service. So we're only touching the database for the incremental changes. And then all the recovery is offloaded. Saves a ton of resources on the database. So you've eliminated the weekly pull. Now you've eliminated all those validation processes with the recovery service. Next, for immutability, in the automation workflow, there's no object storage immutability for the backups. That means that the sysdba could drop down to an RMAN prompt and delete your backups because they're not controlled by they're controlled fully by RMAN. And object storage doesn't understand, database backups. It's just a general purpose storage location. So if it gets a request to delete, it's going to delete. The recovery service, on the other hand, is database aware and is policy controlled. So when you set your policy, it understands, if you set a 30-day policy, it understands what data to keep around for 30 days. And if an sysdba dropped to the RMAN prompt and tried to do a deletion, the recovery service would basically send back a message that says that's not allowed because the backups are protected by policy. So it gives us an inherent immutability capability because recovery service is in control of the lifecycle of the database. Object storage doesn't have that purview into how all the pieces of the database fit together because it's general storage. Recovery time with object storage is very variable. You have to think, okay, if I do a Sunday full backup and I do incrementals for the rest of the week, if I have to restore to Friday, that means I have to restore the incremental for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. If I restore on Tuesday, I only have to pick up Monday. So it's this variable concept of how long it's going to take because there's this number of incrementals between you and the last full. With recovery service, it's a very predictable recovery experience because every incremental that's taken every day turns into a virtual full. So that means if I'm on Thursday and I ask for a recovery on Thursday, there's a virtual full that ran on Thursday that would satisfy that need, and you only restore just the one full backup. There's not all these incrementals that you have to process. The backup lifecycle with object storage is dependent on an active database. It has to have RMAN running to maintain the lifecycle of the database backups. So those two are tightly tied together. And if you deprecate the database, obviously the backups that are still around are dependent on that database, and they have to be managed by hand from that point on. In the case of the recovery service, the backups are managed outside the database. The recovery service has the intelligence to understand how backups fit together, how they belong, what time periods they need to be kept till, and that's independent of the database lifecycle. So in the case of recovery service, you could terminate the database. You could have backups, both your operational and long-term retention backups around, and it'll fully manage it all the way through the lifecycle. For the next 5 years, it would manage all that for you because it understands how to do that without database interaction. From a cost metrics perspective, usage in object storage is based on the bucket. So whatever backups end up in the bucket, you get a roll up of what the cost is for the bucket. In the recovery service, we bundle all that up per database. So you can see each individual database and how much space is being used. You can also leverage tagging. Tagging will then tag the backups that are associated with that database. And then you can do a cost roll up, which gives you easy chargeback capabilities. Or just if you want to see all your databases and how much space they're using, we keep track of that on an individual level. And I'll show you that in the UI once we get it to the demo at the end. And then from a health metric perspective, object storage is just storage. It's storing data. It knows it's got the data. It doesn't know how all that data works together. So there's not this concept of a backup health metric. In the case of recovery service, because we're doing work to turn incrementals into fulls, and we're doing offloaded validation, we're doing all this work behind the scenes, there's a health metric that is presented for each database, and we also roll that up into a dashboard. I'll show you both of those in the demo so you can see what that looks like. But we're just giving you a lot more, a deeper insight into what's happening with your backups. So in the end, recovery service is faster, it's more efficient, and it's easier to manage. Okay, so let's move on and talk about the architecture. So I want to do a quick architecture comparison. Um, You'll note one of the first things you'll notice is that all the backup infrastructure for the recovery services in an Oracle managed tenancy. We don't expose that infrastructure to the directly into the customer tenancy. Object storage uses a service gateway, which is just kind of a general access point to get out to the object storage bucket. The recovery service uses a private endpoint, and that creates a specific connection from your tenancy directly into the recovery service. And that's important, and you'll see why that's important here in just as we go through this. So as I mentioned, service gateway is kind of like general communication. It's for services um, not specific to backup. It's just the service gateway for all the services in OCI. Because the recovery service is using private endpoints, we can take that private endpoint and only allow RMAN communication across that endpoint. So that means we can restrict the type of communications that are occurring between the database and the recovery service. And that kind of gives us, a more ransomware protection, if you will, because you don't get just a general file system access. You only get to send backups and retrieve backups with RMAN because that's the only communication we allow. Any database can connect to a object storage bucket. That's what they're designed for, right? You create a bucket location and anybody can connect into that. In the case of recovery service only allows the specific database that's creating backups to reach its backups. So I can't take another database and get to that same location like you can with object storage. It's a very segregated environment. Each database has its own service connection point with unique username and credentials and unique identification of that database to that service location. So we're keeping a very tight connection between the database and the backups to make sure that there's no way that the data can escape that. Okay, so now let's switch over to long-term retention backups. Now remember, these are the once a month, once a quarter, once a year backups. Comparing object storage and autonomous recovery service, the first thing you'll notice between the left and the right is the database service is not involved with this with autonomous recovery service. All the interactions happen within the recovery service itself. So long-term retention backups with object storage um, are retrieved directly from the database. So if you say I want an end of month backup, the process starts at the database and retrieves the backup from the database itself. In the case of recovery service, if you say I need that end of month backup, recovery service will use the existing backups we already have because we've got everything that um, needs to be used for recovery, for creating a database backup, a long-term retention backup. We've got all that. We can do a recovery to a point in time. Now we can create a representation of the database. So create a backup representation of that database to the point in time that you need for long-term retention. So we don't go back to the database for that. Again, relieving work off the database. It's all about relieving work off the database. And object storage has all that database overhead going back to the database. And that's a new full backup for these long-term retention backups. So that means if you're doing a weekly full for your operational backups, it takes 10 hours. And then you have to do another full to satisfy your long-term retention needs. That's just compounding uh, resource utilization on the database itself. In the case of recovery service, there's no database overhead to complete this operation. We're sourcing all the backup data that we need from the recovery service and internal to the recovery service and sending that off to object storage. Long-term retention backups are stored in standard object storage with automation for the object storage destination. In the case of recovery service, long-term retention backups are actually stored in the infrequent access object storage tier. So there's a significant cost difference between that. So again, not touching the database, we're sourcing it from the recovery service and sending it to that infrequent access tier. So again, recovery service is more efficient. We're not going back to the production database. We're not spending hours and hours and hours to do that. Instead, we're sourcing it all from internal backups that we already have in the recovery service. We've got all those existing backups, all those points in time. We can just create it ourselves and send it off to infrequent object storage, which is less expensive than the standard object storage. So now let's look at the cost comparisons when we talk about these two storage destinations. So object storage automation leverages the standard tier. Again, recovery service leverages infrequent access. It does go through the standard tier, but it only stays there for 24 hours. We want a landing space and then have it tier off into the infrequent tier. So it only stays there for a little bit of time. And let's look at what that does for costs. So standard tier is about, what's that? 0.0255 per gigabytes per month. There's a database service component that sits on top of that. That's the software component, if you will, that gives you the licenses for compression, for encryption, all that's bundled up into that. In the case of the recovery service, because we're using both the standard tier for 24 hours and the infrequent tier, you can see that there's a cost difference. And object storage charges by the hour. So this 0.0255 number per gigabytes per month becomes this really small number per hour. And because we're only staying 24 hours, that's the number we have to use. So let's look at that. On the left, standard tier, if we were talking about a 10 terabyte backup, gives us about $255 and then about $51 in the software component. In case of the recovery service, you can see the standard tier is being used, but it's only for that 24 hours. So it's $8, $8.50 for the same 10 terabytes. And then it goes into the infrequent tier. So after that 24 hours for the lifetime of the database backup, that long-term retention backup, so for the next 5 years, that you only pay for the infrequent tier, and you can see that that's $100. And then the database service, still the same because it's a 10 terabyte database backup, and that's the $51. So total on the left for object storage, 306 and 159 for the recovery service because it's leveraging that infrequent access tier. When it's time for recovery, You don't have to worry about going and finding it. Remember, the recovery service knows about all the backups that have occurred, and it created the backup that went off to object storage. So it knows about all that data, where it lives. So it's just a simple request from RMAN, give it the point in time, and um, and it'll retrieve the data without you having to worry about, where it's stored downstream. If it's in the, standard tier, in the infrequent tier, you don't have to worry about any of those details. The automation will take care of that for you. Okay, so let's switch to a demo now. So let me switch screens and go over to the OCI console. Okay, so this is base database. It looks exactly the same on all the database services. And also would look the same for multi-cloud. Multi-cloud has a little bit of different information because it tells you, a little bit about the cloud that it's sitting in, but generally this is all the same information. And you can see you've got this, you know, rich, more complete information when recovery service is enabled. You've got this concept of health. We talked about that earlier, which is not a concept in object storage because object storage is just standard storage. We've got a concept of data loss exposure. I talked about the optional capability of protecting the database in real time. So for this particular database, you can see I have real time enabled and my data loss exposure is 0 seconds because the database is being protected as changes come in, so I don't have any data loss exposure. If real time was turned off, if this was disabled that I have highlighted down here, then the data loss exposure would be based on how frequent the archive redo log backups are occurring. And then it tells me a little bit about failed backups and completed backups, the next scheduled backup. This is the space utilization. So for this particular database, this is the space utilization. So you can see that easily in the console to see that information. And then, of course, this is the policy that I'm using. And you can set the policy, which gives you your number of days of retention. The policy also has a concept of retention lock. So let's go in here and look real quick. So you can see this policy has a concept of retention lock. That's something that's also unique to the recovery service, and that is, I talked about general immutability, where the DBA can't drop to an RMAN prompt and just tell the recovery service to delete backups. We don't allow that because of the policy. And the policy itself now in recovery service, if you enable retention lock, you can't reduce the value in the policy. So I've set 27 days here. If I try to turn that down, it'll tell me I'm not allowed because there's a retention lock on this policy. So that means the backups for the database are tied to this policy and the policy can't be lowered now. So again, another level of protection. This is an option, and we made it an option because once this is enabled, no one gets to delete the backups. So you can't change your mind. If you set 90 days worth of retention on this and then you change your mind about the retention, you're stuck with that once the retention lock is enabled because you can't change it no matter what level of rights that you have inside of your Oracle tenancy. You don't get the option to change it. You can't call us and have us change it. Like this is an immutable setting, and we don't allow that uh, those database backups to be reduced. So we made that an option. When you first turn it on, you get a little bit of time to experiment with it before it enables. I can show you that in just a couple minutes here. Um, and then, of course, there's real-time data protection. This is the option that I turned on. So that little check mark there gives me the option to turn on real-time protection for the database. Um, if I want long-term retention backup, I can create it right here. So I can specify a long-term retention backup and specify days or years. So I could, create one for 5 years. Call this April 18th. And then I click create. That gets submitted. And it'll pop up here in just a second while I'm talking. And the recovery service now will build a long-term retention backup based on this point in time for the database. And again, it's using the backups that already occurred. So I've got all these backups for the database. It's just using that to construct this long-term retention backup. And you'll see here's one that I created back on the 10th. So you can see it has long-term backup. I gave it this name, and you'll see it has a specific expiration date based on I set this one for a year, so you can see it was started on April 11th. It's going to expire in 2026 on the same day because I set it for a year. Okay. And then, of course, if I wanted to restore, remember I talked about you don't have to worry about where it lives. So if I want this database, this long-term retention backup to be used for like an auditing situation, I can just go in here, click Create Database from this backup, and now it'll create a database for me based on that particular backup. So I can get that, and then I can hand that version of the database off to like an auditor to prove that, yes, I've recovered the database to this point in time. And when you click Create Database, let's see, I'll show you one other little thing here. I can put it anywhere I want, right? Like I'm in this compartment. I can choose any compartment. Um, I can choose another name. I can choose a completely different region. I have all these different regions that my tenancy is enabled for. So I can put it in a different region. I can change the shape. So like, let's say my production database uses, I don't, 20 cores. I can turn it all the way down to 1 core because it's for compliance. I'm not running anything against it. So I want to keep my costs low. So I can do that. I can change the shape of the database all at the same time. So it gives you a lot of flexibility when you're wanting to use one of those long-term retention backups, which is different than if I want to restore the database, right? I get different options here. Restore to latest, restore to timestamp, restore to SCN, because I'm looking for a very granular restore with operational databases, database backups. In the case of this, I just want this point in time for my auditors. I also talked about there's a dashboard where all this rolls up. So if I go over here to the backup destination, notice this is lit up for autonomous recovery service. So we've got a dashboard that's specific to just backups. So if you want to separate your DBAs from the people who are managing your backups, you don't have to allow your backup folks to get into the database management console. They can just use this protected databases area. Gives a lot of the same information. Um, and then from here, if I go up, you'll see this says protected databases and it's plural. If I click on that, there's my little dashboard that shows all the databases in my compartment and all the settings. So you can see I have real-time enabled. These don't have real-time enabled. I can see my policy information, database size, how much space each database is using. Like I get all this at my fingertips. And this is something that's unique to recovery service, as I mentioned before. This is not a concept that is in the object storage destinations. And then I have links back to the database. So I can go back to the source database from here because we've got a tight coupling between the two. I can see back and forth between them. So I can simply go back to the database and this is my database again. Um, so the recovery service is, very, very specific to protecting the Oracle database. We're giving you a lot of rich information. For operational backups, same cost. And for the long-term retention backups, we actually have reduced the cost because we're integrating them into that infrequent access tier. Oh, the other thing I was going to show you real quick, let's go back and look at this. Let's look at this policy because I mentioned that we've got this, policy set up. So I've got my 27-day policy here. If I try to edit it, and I'm going to try to turn it down today. So I'm trying to change it from 27 to 26. And here we go. So the 27-day retention period is permanently locked for this policy. So I'm not allowed to change it. I can go up. I can change that to 28. It would let me go up, but I cannot bring it down. So again, making sure that your database is protected. You've locked your retention. So it's not general, immutability that just follows the policy, but now you've locked the retention period in the policy. So again, more strict control for the database. Okay. Were there any questions in the Q&A that I need to cover?
Yes, Kelly,
Okay.
there was a great question if we can provide automation for LTRs.
Automation for LTRs. Okay. So today, LTR, as you saw, is on demand. There are APIs, there's command lines. You can, script that yourself. Um, and that's in the current version. We are working on a scheduling implementation that will allow you to set up a cadence automatically in the policy. So we're going to move the creation of the LTR into the policy and allow you to set up a cadence. And that'll be coming up in the future. So watch out for that. But today you would have to leverage either the command line or the APIs to automate the creation of the long-term retention backup. I'm also working on a blog right now, so over the next couple of weeks, watch for that. I'll publish a blog, and we'll talk about it on a future office hours as well. Then I'll show you the steps for, invoking the command line. It's not incredibly difficult. I think all of us as, you know, IT professionals, we've all had to use cron, so it's pretty easy to set up a cron job that just runs in the background and that does all that. But we will be bringing that into the UI in a future release. Okay, is there any other question? Any other last questions? Give it just a second. Okay. Okay, there are no other questions. Thank you for joining us on this Friday. We have these once a month, and we hope you join us in the future. We post in the recording and out to the Ask Tom website. So under our office hours, this recording will appear. And I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much.